Hi, it's time for another verb of the day. Today's verb is render, and this was another verb that was requested by the viewer Luis. Luis, thank you so much for sharing another great idea. Now, let's take a closer look at some of the many ways you can use the verb render. The first way you might encounter this verb means to provide or give a service, to give help, or some type of assistance. So I know sometimes I have read newspaper articles that have recounted kind of an emergency situation, and it has described a person who rendered first aid. They gave that kind of help to someone in a medical emergency. A second way you might hear render used can mean to submit or present something for inspection or consideration. You might see this used more in legal situations. So I wouldn't say that's so much an everyday use for this particular verb, but you may still encounter it based on your type of work. A third way render gets used means to deliver a verdict or a judgment. Again, this is another legal meaning to it, but if you're reading newspaper articles about court cases, you might hear something like the jury rendered its verdict, right? So it made its decision. Was the person found guilty or not guilty, or liable or not liable? A fourth way we can use the verb render can mean to cause to be or to cause something to become. For this fourth definition, you might think of a much easier verb, which is just to make. Okay? So sometimes you might hear something being rendered useless, right? So something caused this thing to become unusable. A fifth way you may encounter the verb render can mean to present something or depict something artistically. So this could be something done in a painting, done in a sculpture. It could be the theatrical arts as well. A sixth way you can use the verb render means to translate. So you're going from one language into another. And a seventh way the verb render gets used is more common in cooking. And so that would be where you melt down fat. So you might be cooking it at a rather high temperature, and you may be cooking it for a long period of time in order to melt it. For now, you should know that render is a regular verb. If you want to make the progressive form of this verb, all you need to do is add ing, and that forms rendering. The past tense and the participle forms of this verb can be made by adding ed. Our base verb, render, ends in a voice sound. So this means when we add that ed ending, we're just going to be adding a d sound. And I'm not going to add an extra syllable to the verb. So the past tense and the participle forms of the verb should sound like this. Rendered, rendered. Now, I know you're probably thinking, oh my goodness, so many different ways to use this verb, and I have even more. So there are a few phrasal verbs that you might encounter, and so I thought we could discuss those and look at some more examples. The first phrasal verb you might encounter is to render in or render into. This can be used three different ways. The first might go back to one of those earlier definitions, so representing or depicting or portraying something either in a visual or verbal form. Okay, so an example of this in a sentence might be, this app links all your accounts and then it renders your expenses in various graphs. So what we would really be saying here is it shows, it depicts, maybe grouping the types of expenses into things like insurance, medical, food, entertainment, etc. right? So you have this kind of visual picture to see how money is being spent. A second way you can use render into means to translate or express something in another language. An example of this. In his role, he renders the manuals in Spanish. So we don't know here what languages these manuals begin in, but we know the end product is going to be in the Spanish language. A third way to use render in or render into can mean to convert digital information on a computer into a specific format. An example of this in a sentence might be, can you render the document in a PDF? Right? So there we're naming a specific digital format or file format. The next phrasal verb you might encounter is to render up. This can also have a couple different meanings. One way to use it can mean to submit, to present, or to provide something. An example of this. Have you rendered up your final loan payment? Right? So I will mention that this is not, again, a super common phrasal verb. Maybe a little more common to hear, especially if you're amongst friends. Have you made? Have you completed, right, your final loan payment there? Our last way to use render up can mean to surrender or turn over something to another individual. Here's an example of that. The court ordered the company to render up its ill-gotten profits. So, what this sentence is suggesting is that the company was probably doing something illegal, right? We had some sort of hearing or matter pursued, and a court has looked at this, and now the company is being told you must turn over these profits or you must give them up, surrender them. Now let's continue using our verb of the day in a couple different verb tenses. Today we'll practice the imperative and the present progressive. Let's start with the imperative. We use the imperative to give commands. This is where we are telling a person to either do or not do an action. And it's rather unique in English because we do not have a stated subject. If you're a regular viewer of my videos, you might get a little tired of me going through the process of how we set up sentences, and you're probably familiar with me saying we're going to have our subject and then we're going to have our verb and describing that. Here, there is no subject. It's because it's understood. It's either you singular or you plural, depending on how many people with whom you're communicating. So generally, to begin an imperative sentence, you can just begin with the base verb. Okay? Now, sometimes students will tell me that this feels a little uncomfortable to be so direct, to just command someone to do something. So you could always add the word please to the beginning of an imperative sentence. You could also add please to the end, but you only need it one time or in one place. Now, an example of where you may encounter many imperatives are in recipes. So if you read and look for recipes, you might encounter our verb of the day. An example of this might be, first, render the fat in a crock pot with a small bit of water. Okay, so this recipe is telling us the steps we need to do to make a particular dish. And so that's why we have the imperative here. It's telling us our first step, right? And then second step would probably begin with another imperative verb telling us the next action to take. Now, if you want to make a negative imperative, begin your sentences either with do not and then the base verb, or don't and then the base verb. So, an example of this in a sentence might be, don't render services until we receive payment. The sentence would go back to that first definition of providing here. So here we've got a very specific command not to maybe do work until we know we have been paid for it. Now you'll notice there are no yes or no questions in the imperative. These are just commands, either to do or not do a particular action. Now let's move on and talk about sentences in the present progressive. Many teachers and textbooks will call this the present continuous, and that is just fine. It means the exact same thing. In the present progressive or present continuous, we're either talking about actions that are happening now or actions that are in progress during a time period that has not yet been completed. The reason I like saying present progressive is the two P's in the name of the verb tense can help you remember you need to make your verb. This is a verb tense where we need to pay attention to our subject, and that's because we will be using a present form of be. And be has three forms. So if your subject is I, you're going to use am and then the ing form of the verb. If your subject is you, we, or they, use are, A-R-E, and then the ing form of the verb. And finally, if your subject is he, she, or it, use is, and then the ing form of the verb. Let's take a look at an example. The jury is rendering its verdict now. Now, this might sound like a silly sentence. However, I know I've heard this as live reporters cover really important trials and events. So here in the United States, there are certain legal matters that get covered in great detail. And so we'll have reporters covering trials, and you might hear something like this, kind of announcing this big decision that many people may be interested in. Now, if you want to make a negative present progressive sentence, what you need to do is, again, start with your subject, use the form of be that matches, then use not, and then the. Here's another example. The defendants aren't rendering their emails to the prosecution. This goes back to one of those earlier definitions where we talked about submitting something for inspection. That's what's being discussed here. And finally, let's look at making a yes or no question in the present progressive. To do this, start with be. You want to use the form of be that matches your subject. That subject comes next. And then use the ing form of the verb. Here's our last example. Is this weather rendering travel impossible? Okay. This goes back to that definition of causing something to be impossible. So here in much of the United States, we've had pretty severe winter weather. There's been sleet, there's been ice, there's been heavy snow. All of these things could be causing or making travel impossible. Now let's spend a moment looking at some words that are related to our verb render. And the first word we're going to discuss is a noun form of this word. The noun render has the exact same spelling and the exact same pronunciation as our verb. And if you happen to work in construction, it might be a word you encounter. It's very, very specific. So a first coat of plaster that might be applied to either a brick or stone surface. This might be used in the process of forming or making a wall. So, an example of this in a sentence. He's using lime render to prepare the wall for the pantry. Okay. Now, if you are not into a lot of home renovation or construction work yourself, you're probably not going to encounter this noun very often. It's certainly not something that is used every day, again, unless there's some type of construction project. Now, there's another noun, though, you may encounter a little bit more, and that noun adds another er to the end. So renderer can sound a little funny or difficult to say, but one way to use this noun is to refer to a person who applies finishes to a building, right? So they're using that plaster generally. So an example of how you might hear this used The renderer should finish the job by the end of the week. Right? So here maybe someone is constructing particular walls, preparing them, and this particular work should be done soon. But another way, especially if you're in technology, you may encounter it, is to talk about a software application or some type of component that generates a visual image from some model. An example of this in a sentence might be, renderers are used in video games, simulators, and visual effects. So again, if you're working outside of tech, you're probably not likely to encounter this very often. But you can see that this word gets very specific in a number of different fields. Again, I want to say a special thanks to Luis for suggesting today's verb. I want to thank you all for watching. Have a great day.